found that this feeling replaced by something more comfortable. They were such a genuine, simple, kindly couple, these Windlebirds, that he lost awe and retained only gratitude. He loved them both. He opened his heart to them. It was not long before he had told them the history of his career, skipping the earlier years and beginning with the entry of wealth into his life. "It makes you feel funny," he confided to Mr. Windlebird's sympathetic ear, "suddenly coming into a pot of money like that. You don't seem hardly able to realize it. I don't know what to do with it." Mr. Windlebird smiled paternally. "The advice of an older man who has had, if I may say so, some little experience of finance might be useful to you there. Perhaps if you'd allow me to recommend some sound investment." Roland glowed with gratitude. "There's just one thing I'd like to do before I start putting my money into anything. It's like this." He briefly related the story of his unfortunate affair with Muriel Coppin. Within an hour of his departure in the aeroplane, his conscience had begun to trouble him on this point. He felt that he had not acted well towards Muriel. True, he was practically certain that she didn't care a bit about him and was in love with Albert, the silent mechanic. But there was just the chance that she was mourning over his loss. And, anyhow, his conscience was sore. "I'd like to give her something," he said. "How much do you think?" Mr. Windlebird perpended. "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send my own lawyer to her with, say, £1,000. Not a cheque, you understand, but 1,000 golden sovereigns that he can show her, roll about on the table in front of her eyes. That'll console her. It's wonderful the effect money in the raw has on people." "I'd rather make it 2,000," said Roland. He had never really loved Muriel, and the idea of marrying her had been a nightmare to him. But he wanted to retreat with honor. "Very well, make it 2,000 if you like. Though I don't quite know how old Harrison is going to carry all that money." As a matter of fact, old Harrison never had to try. On thinking it over, after he had cashed Roland's cheque, Mr. Windlebird came to the conclusion that £700 would be quite as much money as it would be good for Miss Coppin to have all at once. Mr. Windlebird's knowledge of human nature was not at fault. Muriel jumped at the money, and a letter in her handwriting informed Roland next morning that his slate was clean. His gratitude to Mr. Windlebird redoubled. "And now," said Mr. Windlebird genially, "we can talk about that money of yours and the best way of investing it. What you want is something which, without being in any way what is called speculative, nevertheless returns a fair and reasonable amount of interest. What you want is something sound, something solid, yet something with a bit of a kick to it, something which can't go down and may go soaring like a rocket." Roland quietly announced that was just what he did want, and lit another cigar. "Now, look here, Bleke, my boy. As a general rule, I don't give tips, but I've taken a great fancy to you, Bleke, and I'm going to break my rule. Put your money," he sank his voice to a compelling whisper, "put every penny you can afford into Wildcat Reefs." He leaned back with the benign air of the alchemist who has just imparted to a favorite disciple the recently discovered secrets of the philosopher's stone. "Thank you very much, Mr. Windlebird," said Roland gratefully. "I will." The Napoleonic features were lightened by that rare, indulgent smile. "Not so fast, young man," laughed Mr. Windlebird. "Getting into Wildcat Reefs isn't quite so easy as you seem to think. Shall we say that you propose to invest £30,000? Yes? Very well, then. £30,000. Why, if it got about that you were going to buy Wildcat Reefs on that scale, the market would be convulsed." Which was perfectly true. If it had got about that anyone was going to invest £30,000 or pence in Wildcat Reefs, the market would certainly have been convulsed. The house would have rocked with laughter. Wildcat Reefs were a standing joke, except to the unfortunate few who still held any of the shares. The thing will have to be done very cautiously. No one must know. But I think I say, I think I can manage it for you. You're awfully kind, Mr. Windlebird. Not at all, my dear boy. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I shall be doing a very good turn to another pal of mine at the same time. He filled his glass. This, he paused to sip, this pal of mine has a large holding of wildcats he wants to realize in order to put the money into something else, in which he is more personally interested. Mr. Windlebird paused. His mind dwelt for a moment on his overdrawn current account at the bank. In which he is more personally interested, he repeated dreamily. But, of course, you couldn't unload £30,000 worth of wildcats in the public market. Oh, I quite see that, assented Roland. It might, however, be done by private negotiation, he said. I must act very cautiously. Give me your cheque for the 30,000 tonight, and I'll run up to town tomorrow morning and see what I can do. He did it. What hidden strings he pulled, what levers he used, Roland did not know. All Roland knew was that somehow, by some subtle means, Mr. Windlebird brought it off. 2 days later his host handed him 20,000 £1 shares in the Wildcat Reef gold mine. "There, my boy," he said. "It's awfully kind of you, Mr. Windlebird." "My dear boy, don't mention it. If you're satisfied, I'm sure I am." Mr. Windlebird always spoke the truth when he could. He spoke it now. It seemed to Roland, as the days went by, that nothing could mar the pleasant, easy course of life at the Windlebirds. The fine weather, the beautiful garden, the pleasant company, all these things combined to make this sojourn an epoch in his life. He discovered his mistake one lovely afternoon as he sat smoking idly on the terrace. Mrs. Windlebird came to him, and a glance was enough to show Roland that something was seriously wrong. Her face was drawn and tired. A moment before, Roland had been thinking life perfect. The only crumpled rose leaf had been the absence of an evening paper. Mr. Windlebird would bring one back with him when he returned from the city, but Roland wanted one now. He was a great follower of country cricket, and he wanted to know how Surrey was faring against Yorkshire. But even this crumpled rose leaf had been smoothed out, for Johnson, the groom, who happened to be riding into the nearest town on an errand, had promised to bring one back with him. He might appear at any moment now. The sight of his hostess drove all thoughts of sport out of his mind. She was looking terribly troubled. It flashed across Roland that both his host and hostess had been unusually silent at dinner the night before. And later, passing Mr. Windlebird's room on his way to bed, he had heard their voices, low and agitated. Could they have had some bad news? "Mr. Bleke, I want to speak to you." Roland moved like a sympathetic cow, and waited to hear more. "You were not up when my husband left for the city this morning, or he would have told you himself. Mr. Bleke, I hardly know how to break it to you." "Break it to me?" "My husband advised you to put a very large sum of money in a mine called Wildcat Reefs." "Yes, £30,000." "As much as that? Oh, Mr. Bleke!" She began to cry softly. She pressed his hand. Roland gaped at her. "Mr. Bleke, there has been a terrible slump in Wildcat Reefs. To-day they may be absolutely worthless." Roland felt as if a cold hand had been laid on his spine. Worthless?" he stammered. Mrs. Windlebird looked at him with moist eyes. "You can imagine how my husband feels about this. It was on his advice that you invested your money. He holds himself directly responsible. He is in a terrible state of mind. He is frantic. He has grown so fond of you, Mr. Bleke, that he can hardly face the thought that he has been the innocent instrument of your trouble." Roland felt that it was an admirable